this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Fractal Design Focus 2. In this video, I'm going to be unboxing and setting up the Focus 2 and showing you the build process for it, as well as talking about the highlights along the way and some of the features and things of interest about this case. I'm going to start off with a little overview of it as we go through this unboxing process, and then by the end, you'll see a full build, including a Fractal 240mm cooler, which I'm going to be doing a video on separately. I'll also link to the case in the description and add all the specs for both the case and the build, so the motherboard and all the other details you need to know. So check that out, linked in the description below to find out more about each of the things that I'm using in this build process. But I'm going to show you all the different elements of it and talk to you about it. This is a mid-tower case, which is capable of holding up to a 360mm radiator on the front, 240 on the top, and it will work with M80X, ATX, and ITX motherboards, and has an interesting setup that includes two 140mm fans and a front-mounted pier shoe, which is interesting. It doesn't have a second bay or a pier shoe that's hidden away. I'm going to show some of the elements of that as we go through. Now, this is an interesting case for a number of different reasons. As standard, it includes mounting brackets for two 3.5-inch drives and two 2.5-inch drives at the rear, but you can also buy adapters so you can install more. It also doesn't come with a USB-C front panel connection, which is fairly unusual for a modern motherboard. I'm going to do a review video separately on this case if you want to hear my thoughts on what it's like. But for this video, I'm going to stick to basically talking about the build process and the things that I discovered along the way and the things that I like and don't like about it, and my tips for when you build in it, because it is curious. And I did have a problem with the 240mm rad installation, and I think that's important to show off, so I'm going to go through that and show you the details of that as we go through. Now, obviously the front and rear panels are removable. The sides come off, the front comes off, the rear comes off. It's all detachable. You'll see there's a number of clips along the bottom of the door, so it's not easily going to fall off when you undo it. And that's nice because it means it's held in place really securely, not just with the thumb screws, but with those clips at the bottom as well. At the rear, you'll also find a similar setup. And one of the things I will note is I didn't really feel like initially when I opened this up that there was going to be much room for cable management, and it didn't feel like there's a lot of space back here. But what you will notice is there are a lot of cable tidying clips, and I'll show you some of those in action later on. Again, the door on this has a number of clips on it, so it really isn't just going to come apart with these. It's very sturdy, nicely designed, cleverly thought out, and interesting in the way you're laying out the hard drives, and I'll show you what I mean in a second, but you can see some of it here. Now, as it's mentioned already, it comes with two 140mm fans as standard. You could swap those out for three 120mm, and I think that might actually be preferable because, as you can see here, there's some rather large gaps around those fans as the default, and I think that looks a bit odd personally. You can see some of it through the front. Obviously, the case is open. There's a lot of light shining here, so you can see it through there. Perhaps in your room, it might be a bit darker and it might not be an issue. And if you don't have loads of RGB going on inside, then that's another point of interest. The front panel comes off with a bit of a tug at the bottom, as you can see, and then it has a nice dust shield to protect from dust ingress, which will happen over time. Now, I did contemplate swapping out the fans for some RGB ones. I have these Prisma AL140 fans. They're PWM RGB fans I actually bought for the Fractal Torrent that I've done a video on separately. But then I decided that I was actually going to stick with the original setup because I don't have 120mm fans and I still have the same problem. And I actually think it would be worse with two 140 RGB fans because then you'd see the RGB lighting and the massive gap between the fans. On the bottom underneath the PSU, you have a nice another dust cover there. And at the rear, I'm going to give you a taste now of what you can see in terms of the mounting for the drives. You'll notice there's no hard disk drive cage as the traditional setup, but instead you have these brackets along the side. So basically you're mounting your drives directly to the case itself, and there's a few different notches. This actually makes the drive setup fairly easy, although I do wonder about vibrations and noise from platter hard drives and the issue that might have over time and how loud that might get. You can see on the right hand side you have the SSD mounting points. That is really simple because it's basically just some bits to stick out that you push the drives into, and I'll show you that in a second. There's no included box full of extra stuff, just a bag and then 3 cables for the front. So this is interesting because you have the USB cable, the USB-A cable, the front panel connections, and that's that chunky affair there, and I'll show you where to plug that in later on. The HD audio, so that's front panel 3.5mm connection. Again, I'll show you where to plug that. And then the power connection, so the power switch and the power LED. There's hardly any cables here. This is fairly unusual. Usually you'd have USB-C and a bit more cabling to go on there, which means this is going to be fairly straightforward to set up, which is pretty nice. Now, alongside that, you also get a bag with some rubber washers that you can see there, some plastic cable ties, and 3 lots of screws. So this doesn't look too shocking. In the left-hand side of it, you have 4 screws for your power supply unit. You then have a bunch of screws for the motherboard mounting, and then the final one is for the hard disk drive mounting. As I said, the SSDs just push into the clips. The hard disk drives are the only one you require screws for. I'm going to show you the process for that now just to demonstrate it. You have a 3.5-inch hard drive, and I have a 6TB drive here I'm using for demo purposes, and you essentially need just that screws at the end with the flat top on them. And you only need 3 of the screws initially. So what you do is use the rubber washers. They sit between the screw and the mounting point on the hard drive. And you attach 3 of those. So 3 of those washers and then 3 of the screws into the hard drive. And essentially it's just setting it up. So the way this is going to work is it's basically just going to clip into the holes on the rear of the case, and then you're going to secure them down, tightening them up, and tightening one in particular, which is basically going to fit through the front of the case into the rear. Very unusual setup for what I've seen previously in other builds, and yet really easy in terms of the installation process. So here you can see a demo of it. There's 2 mounting points, as I said, so you've got one at the top and one at the bottom. Mount at your preference. I'm just using the top one for demo purposes here, but you could use either or both. Obviously, you do potentially, as a standard setup, have space for 2 hard disk drives and 2 2.5-inch SSDs. Make sure you don't do what I've done and put the screw in the wrong place, because I've done that. So I'm just swapping that over, and now you can see that I obviously have 3 in there and then 1 gap, and that's going to go through from the front with the final one. So you're basically just putting the drive into place, slipping it down through the top holes, sliding it down so it locks into place on the bottom ones, and that just gently holds it in place there. Then you just flip the case over to access the other side and use that final screw to tighten things up. Obviously tightening up the other ones that are now sitting down there, but you can see how it works. So they sit in the big hole and then slide down into that notch. But then the 4th and final screw goes through the hole in the front and then secures the drive in place a little more. Obviously, as I said, issue potentially with a platter hard drive with the vibrations potentially going through. This is obviously what the rubber washers are for, to prevent that somewhat, but I do feel like maybe mounted directly there it might cause some issues with sound. It's really going to vary, and it's not something I was able to test in great depth, but I just wanted to talk about it. Anyway, here you can see SSD mounting, really simple, and obviously no moving parts in those, so it's a bit simpler and quieter, but basically there's just pushes into place. There's no screws required at all. There's just some little mounting points on there, which you just push it into. Then obviously the data cable plugs into the bottom of that and then runs into your motherboard, and I'll show you where to connect that up later on. You can then run your SATA power connections. So I've got a daisy chain cable from a power supply unit. I've done a separate video on power supplies, which I'll link to in the description if you want to know where to plug in your various cables and how that works. But I'm going to show you the steps for it here as well, so you can see those 2 connected up. One thing you will notice is there isn't a great deal of cable channeling at the back of the case, and that carries through to the front, because this is an interesting case, as I mentioned already, because the power supply unit mounts in the front of the case instead of in the rear. There's also no shroud and no caddy, so it is on display, which may be beneficial depending on the design of your power supply unit. I've got this nice looking Strix power supply that I purchased a while back for a different build, and it is a nice white one, and it kind of stands out, but it also doesn't have particularly nice cables. They're not held together really nice, so they're kind of all over the place, and they're a little bit fiddly to get looking nice, and I'll show you what I mean a bit more about that later on, because I think it could be a lot better with some cable combs or maybe some custom cables. But the thing that's weird about this is it's not hidden in any way, so it really is quite painfully obvious if you're not very good at cable tidying, and that will show at the end. And then obviously using those power supply screws that I showed you earlier on that come in the package with the case, and then just securing the power supply to the bottom of the case so it doesn't move around. Here's the next oddity of the case. Obviously, now we all have all the cables at the front. We have to get them to the back. Down the bottom, just here is a small hole where you can run those cables through. Depending on what you're installing, you obviously have either a lot of cables or not very many. I've got quite a few because I need two 8-pin power supply unit cables for the CPU at the top of the motherboard, the 24-pin power supply unit cable, obviously the SATA power cable, and then PCIe for the graphics card as well. If you have other things, let's say fan controllers and whatever else, you might end up with even more cables and even more mess to deal with. And there isn't very much you can do about it at the front of the case, although some cable ties might sort things out if you want to be a bit more aggressive. I'm not actually using that many cable ties in this process, because I'm probably going to strip out a lot of these parts in the future for future build videos. So don't criticize my cabling that much. Just think that not everybody's super at cable tidying, and maybe this is a good demo of what it might look like if you're one of those people that either isn't bothered about cables or isn't particularly good at making things neat. But you can see some cable tie places, even on the front of the case, just below the point where these cables are going through now. So you could potentially tie them down there to hide them away a bit. And I'm going to leave that now to show you at the end just how much of those cables you can still see. Once you've read them to the rear, there's another usual channeling that you'd expect to see. On a lot of other cases, you'll see some sort of plastic areas where you can run the cables into and hide them away. There's not that much going on here in terms of that, but there are quite a few different hooks and loops in order to be able to tuck them away. I'm using Velcro ties to temporarily keep the cables neat, but you can see on the right hand side for these CPU power cables that I'm running up to the top, there are some cable tied points, and I'm going to make use of them just to neaten things up a little bit here. So there's a number of these at least, so you can tie your cables down, and you probably will need to if you've got a lot of cables as well, just to fit the back of the case on. Although I will say, even despite my lack of tidying that you will see later, it does still manage to shut up nicely, so I wasn't too underwhelmed by the door. So it is certainly a good setup there. At first glance, it looks like there's not going to be enough room for a lot of mess, but actually pays off in the end. So these cables run up to the top, and they are the power supply unit for the CPU that connects up to the motherboard. They're used for overclocking and things like that. It's pretty important, but basically you can see that I'm tucking them along the edge of this. And this is obviously going to vary depending on your motherboard. And again, I'll leave all the information on the specs of this setup in the description. Next up is the motherboard installation. It has the ATX points already installed. So the sound-offs are already installed for it. So I'm using an ATX motherboard. This is a 12th gen motherboard for an Intel with a Core i7 12700K CPU. I'm also using Corsair's new RAM, and I'll leave information on that in the description as well, which is RGB. And as a point of note, it's not low profile RAM. And that's interesting because I come across a problem in a little while. And there is a recommendation in the notes on this that you do use low profile RAM, but actually you don't need to, which is an interesting point to bear in mind when you're going through this build process, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So use those motherboard screws to secure the motherboard in the various different points in here. Now you can already see that we have quite a lot of space in various different places. You'll notice on the right hand side, for example, where those drives mount, there's quite a lot of room there, but there's also no cable hiding tray of any sort. So again, the cables will run to the back, and then they've got to run through to the front to plug in and connect up, and you'll see that it ends up with quite a mess there that might make you feel uncomfortable depending on how you feel about tidying cables up. So I'm running those two 8-pin CPU power connections from the rear through to the top now, and I'm doing this early on because I'm going to top mount a 240mm radiator that you saw earlier on. So I'm going to be working on that in a little while, and I wanted to demo what that was going to be like and the setup process for that too, because it can get a little bit messy. That's the Lumen S24 from Fractal, which is a 240mm CPU cooler. You could potentially mount a 360mm on the front, although generally I prefer to use the front for intake purposes. But basically what I'm doing is plugging in these cables now so that they have plenty of room for mounting that cooler, and also still being able to connect these up, because what you don't want to do is connect the cooler up first and then have to fiddle around trying to get your fingers underneath it. And actually that does become a problem, so I'd highly recommend doing it this way. Makes the process a little bit easier. So as I said, I'm using the Fractal Lumen S24, and I'm going to do a video separately on this to go in a lot more depth on how to set it up. I'm going to show you some of the steps for the build process now. Obviously, this is an Intel setup, so we don't need the AMD stuff, for example. And there are some things of interest about this cooler. First of all, you'll notice very stealthy fans. It doesn't have any RGB lighting, so it's a great fit for this case. It also has the pump built directly into the radiator, which is fairly unusual, rather than in the CPU block itself, which means that you need AIO pump connection from the radiator and then CPU fan connection from the fans, and I'll show you that later. So we're going to be top mounting it and have the option of either putting the tubes to the left or the right hand side. I'm going for the left because I'm not going to have a rear mounted fan, and I thought it would look nice. So there's no fan mounted on the rear as standard of the case. Obviously you could purchase an additional one, although curiously it won't take 140mm at the back, so that's worth keeping an eye out for. So what I'm doing now is mounting the two fans so the cables face towards the rear and also in the same direction as the all-in-one pump will do, the cables for that, and then mounting them so they're exhaust out the top of the case through the radiator, so basically facing those fans downwards in towards the case. Now this is obviously a good fit for this case because it doesn't have RGB lighting on the model that I've got, and so this is actually really beneficial because it makes it a lot easier. RGB fans are a lot more complicated to set up because they require extra cables, and the benefit of these fans actually is they're daisy chainable as well, so they actually connect up together, which makes life a little bit easier. So there's a cable that comes out of each of the fans, one then clips onto the other with the adapter that's included, and you can see the process for that here. So you have two connections coming out, and one connects up to the other, and then the other end of that cable then will connect up to your motherboard, so that then gives the motherboard control over the fans that are on the radiator, and also separately control over the pump that's on the radiator as well, so you have a full control of both. This is fairly unusual for all-in-one coolers. Usually you have one connection that controls everything, but this is actually separated out, and you can see some of that here. So again, there's a connection that comes out of the all-in-one radiator, and that connects up directly to the motherboard, and using that with the AIO pump header on the motherboard, which on this one sits just below the CPU itself, which is fairly interesting. And again, for ease of use, I actually recommend installing these cables before installing the radiator and the pump head. I think that'll make it a little bit easier. And in this case, it should be fairly straightforward to plug in the AIO pump because it's down here below the CPU, but in some motherboard instances, it's actually at the top above the CPU, right near the top of the motherboard, which can be fiddly once you've got the radiator installed. And as I said already, the CPU fans then connect up to the either CPU fan or CPU optional, which is at the top here and the top right. Again, once the radiator is installed, that's going to be really fiddly, so I'm actually doing it beforehand, which in itself makes things a little bit difficult. Now, at this point, I thought everything was going pretty smoothly, and I was really pleased with how the build was going, but what I'd actually tell you is it actually becomes a problem quite quickly, and that's not because of the radiator, it's actually because of the case. For some reason, this case has a little quirk to it where 240mm radiators don't fit in here properly. Now, I actually think this is partly down to the shroud on the motherboard, which essentially doesn't leave much room for the radiator to sit, and the holes won't line up. So you can see here from this shot that you can't actually get the holes to line up with the bracketing on top of the case, which means you can't actually install the radiator like this, which is quite frustrating. As I said earlier, there's a warning in the manual that suggests the height of the RAM. The height of the RAM can't be very tall. I'll leave this detailed in the description, but you'll see it in a second. And there's a warning against that. But interestingly, they include this bracket system, which basically counters that and fixes the problem. I don't think it was the RAM that was holding me back here, though, because I tried some alternative RAM, which I do have, which is low profile, and it didn't solve the problem. This bracket essentially connects up to the radiator and then sticks out and allows you to position the radiator in a different way. So it sort of raises the height of it and also pushes it away from where it would normally mount and makes it a bit further out. So you actually have two lots of brackets, And interestingly, the instructions seem to imply you need to make them so they both face outwards. But what I discovered was actually you need to do the ones that are going to sit at the rear facing outwards and upwards. So they sort of they have a step to them where they mount on, and then they raise up a little bit and have a sort of higher bit at the back that you can see here. So mount those ones so that they sit up at the back, and then you have to mount the other side, so the side that's going to sit at the front of the case, so it faces inwards. I think you're then blocking the radiator exhaust a little bit there, but only a very small amount. Again, this is raised upwards, so it sits higher than the radiator would normally. But once you've installed these brackets, it's then possible to mount the radiator, because you couldn't mount it. And for a moment, I thought I was going to have a big problem on my hands. But with this little bracket that's included with the case, it wasn't an issue. Now, this is an unusual radiator, so I think it's actually included for all 240mm radiators, so it's worth bearing this in mind before you go about the build process. But you can see in the notes here that it says the maximum height of the RAM is 35mm, and it also gives you a suggestion on the size of the RAD. But as I said, the RAM that I'm using is taller than 35mm, and with this bracket installed, it works just fine, so it's not an issue. I actually think it was partly the design of the case is a bit strange, and also the size of the shroud, the protective area on the motherboard. However, I've used this motherboard in other cases of a similar size with a similar setup and not had any issues with mounting radiators. So this is fairly weird. It's a bit of an oddity, and I think perhaps of this case, something to bear in mind. But at least there's an easy fix for it, because it does mount in there really easily. So now we have that set up, and I can now, as you can see, screw in the top. Obviously use the screws that are included with the radiator to screw it in. You may well be using a different radiator, but a lot of these steps will be quite similar. And be sure to check out all-in-one cooler recommendations and guides in my playlists on my channel, because I've seen a lot in the last few months and years if you want to get some guidance on how to set up and install in various different builds. And so now I have it fully mounted into the case, and we're now going about the process of mounting the pump head. So obviously, as I've shown already, the cables are plugged in. You can see the AIO pump connection below the CPU header, and you'll also notice this cable's jutting out at the top, because I've also got all those other ones connected. So now it's just a case of mounting the block. There is one final cable though, which is the RGB connection from the pump head to the motherboard, which is a 5-volt RGB connection. As I said, I'll go into a lot more depth on the setup of this cooler if you're interested, but one of the nice things about it is that you can revolve the top, so you can actually turn it around so that the Fractal logo is sitting in the right place. This gives you the flexibility to mount it sitting in a different direction, so you could mount it with the tubes on the other side as a potential option if you wanted to. I like it this way around because, as I said, I'm not using a fan at the rear, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. And the aesthetic is pretty nice. Quite a stealthy build I've got going on here. We've got a white case, but we've got black motherboard, black CPU cooler, black fans. It's quite a stealthy look and very minimal RGB, with just the RGB RAM and the RGB connection from the pump head, because that's all you've got. So there's one single cable that needs to plug in there, and then that connects up to the 5-volt header, which, by the way, is at the top right underneath the radiator, which means it's going to be a fiddle, but there's also one at the bottom left, so just check your motherboard manual to find out what yours is. Seat the CPU cooler down onto the CPU, and then mount it with the various thumb screws. So there's 4 thumb screws included in here, and they obviously need to be well mounted and attached to make sure that it's sitting in place and the CPU runs cool, because that's an important part of making sure there's a good connection. Not so tight that it causes issues and break the pins on the motherboard, but tight enough that it has a good solid connection between the two. Nice straightforward setup for the most part in this case so far, apart from that small problem with the brackets, so that is definitely one thing to watch out for. Otherwise, it's been a nifty little setup. As shown with the hard drives and the SSDs, that was fairly straightforward. And now you can see we're getting quite near to the end of the build as well. So now some of the other things to bear in mind. Front panel connections. So we have the USB-A connection for the front panel. This is where you plug in your USB connections on top of the case. And this cable plugs in on the right-hand side. You'll see that mine is sticking out towards the front. Sometimes they're facing inwards. It really depends on the motherboard. You might well find that you have 2 of these sometimes on some motherboards, but for this one, it just plugs in like that. and that connects up there. You can see it just down here to give you another shot of it outside the case. The one above that is USB-C, but there's no USB-C connection in this case for some reason as standard, although you can buy an accessory which will give you access to have that if you want to. 24-pin power supply cable is the important one from the power supply unit. Without it, you won't be able to power on your PC, so you make sure you connect that up. And that runs and connects up on the right hand side. Now we have that front panel HD audio cable that I showed you earlier on. This usually goes in the bottom left. You can see it here, AAFP. It may be marked differently on your motherboard, but it's usually in the bottom left. So check your motherboard manual to find out where that is. It might be something like HD audio or something similarly marked, but you'll see the pins for it. You also can't plug it in the wrong way around, because what you will have noticed from that shot is that there's one pin missing in the connection, and you basically need to make sure that lines up with the lack of pinhole on the cable itself. Then you have the front panel power connections, power switch, power LED plus and minus. Again, check your motherboard manual, but on mine it's in the bottom right, which it usually is, to be fair, on most motherboards, and you'll see the markings on the motherboard for where it connects, which ones connect up. There's only 3 cables to connect up here, which again is fairly rare because you usually have reset button and other buttons as well, but it's all basically really simple here. So there's a very minimal amount of cables to connect up, which is certainly a bonus. The one thing left to do is to connect up your drives, depending on what you're using. So you use a data cable for both of them. So you'd need 2 and connect up to your data connection on the motherboard there. Reference the manual, by the way, because I'm using some NVMe SSDs in this build as well, which I'm doing a video on separately, the Crucial P3, for example. And you can basically, if you're using those and using SSD and hard disk drives, some of the ports on the motherboard, if you're using them, may make those drives obsolete or not work correctly, and that can cause problems, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Now, I've also plugged in the SATA power connections for both of these, and don't forget you need data cables from both SSD and hard disk drive if you want them to work. Now I'm just going to quickly smash through tidying up some of these cables. As I said, I'm not going extremely crazy on this because the chances are I'll be taking a lot of these parts out to build another case in the near future, but what it demonstrates is various different points where you can tidy up those cables. So there are a lot of places, but as you can see from the front now, if you look in the top right where the 24-pin power cable is, for example, it's quite messy, and a custom cable might be better. Something from Cable Mod might make that a little bit neater, but there's a lot of cabling comes through there which is a bit messy, and that could be annoying. The graphics card obviously connects up here as well, taking out 2 of those rear panel connections and then plugging in the graphics card. This is a 3060 Ti, and that connection goes in there. And then we obviously have the adapter that we need to plug in as well, and making sure you re-secure the thumb screws. And you can now see that we've got into a nice bit of the build process here, and there is a large chunk of case which doesn't have anything going on there, so there's not much of interest, which on wasted space on the right hand side, for example, but you can also see those drives where they're mounting. So now I need to find the PCIe cables at the rear and then run that through to the front so I can connect up the power for the graphics card. And again, just quickly tidying up some of the cables, because when I was around the front, I noticed just how messy that 24-pin cable is. So just tightening it up a bit at the back might well make things a little bit neater, and obviously securing some of these other cables as well should tidy things up as well and make it a little bit less messy. But you can see without any channeling, they are all over the place a little bit, which is a shame, but you won't notice that once it's all connected up and the back of the case is shut away. So now we're just connecting up with that single connection. Obviously, if you have more, if you have a graphics card with 2 or 3 power connections on it, you might find you're having to run a lot more cables through to the front that you'll then need to deal with. You can see I've got this one with just 1 connection on it, but then it has that extra daisy chain one, which then looks a bit messy, so I ended up using a cable tie, sort of tidy that away. But you can see from this angle as well the mess of cables for the power supply unit at the bottom. Now the final thing of note is obviously I haven't plugged in the 2 front fans at the moment, so the 240mm fans that are mounted as standard on the front. They're obviously not connected up to anything when it's first set up. So you need to remove the cable tie that's holding those in place. And again, just like the cables of the fans on the radiator, these are daisy chain, so you actually have 2 connections for each fan, which means that you can connect them up. So you can connect up those 2 fans and then connect those to a single header on the motherboard, which makes life a little easier. You could connect them separately if you want to, but it's perfectly fine to run them together like this and connect up. You just need a system fan header or a chassis fan header on the motherboard. In this instance, I've got a couple in the bottom right, just down here, you can see, so really easy access, which is great because it means that I'm not going to have loads of extra cables running through to the front, keeps things a little bit neater. Refer to your motherboard manual to find where those headers are, but you'll usually find them spread out around the motherboard, bottom, right, and some at the top as well. It varies from motherboard to motherboard, but there's usually quite a few. And for this few CPU fans, it shouldn't be a problem. So now we have the thing set up and ready to go and turned on first time without any problems. Now, as I said, there's minimal RGB lighting here. I have a little bit on the motherboard itself, a little bit on the pump, and a little bit on the RAM as well. So it's quite a subtle build by the end of it. And you can see the fans spinning up as well. But I am painfully aware of the large gap there, which is a shame, but at least it booted first time. Now we're at the rear, and I'm just going to shut the door because I wanted to demonstrate that it does actually work pretty well. So despite the fact that I haven't excessively cable tied, I managed to get that door on with relative ease. So it just went on and hid away my shame. Now, included in the box is also a magnetic dust filter that you can put on the top. Some might argue that you shouldn't put this on here because it will hamper the exhaust of the cooler. I prefer to put them on because dust falls from the sky when your PC is not on and then gets into your radiator. So I like to try and stop that. How much difference it makes to the cooling, I probably could test in the radiator video if you want to come and see that. And then there's a few little bits of green protective film that run along there. Now you can see, obviously, with the door off, what it looks like and just how visible those cables are. But one of the interesting points that you'll see in a second, if you didn't notice already at the beginning of the video, is there's actually a lip on the door, which does actually cover away some of that problem as well. But from the various different angles, I'm pretty happy with this build. It's a nice looking case, reasonably affordable, and also relatively easy to build in, with the exception of that one problem with the radiator. Fairly straightforward. I think if you put 3 120mm fans on the front, it might look a bit nicer, and you could obviously opt for getting an extra one for the rear as well. You do need to obviously peel some plastic now from the inside and outside of the door, and then mount that door in place. Here you can see what I was talking about. At the bottom of the door is a little bit of fascia which juts out upwards and basically sits in a position that blocks out most of the view of those power cables, which is obviously beneficial and makes it look a little bit nicer. It depends on how you're sitting with it on your desk. I think if you sit with it on your desk, you might not see it depending on the angle of where you're at, but obviously viewed from above, you can still see those cables. You can see from here, for example, you can see them sticking up. Now, I did note earlier on that there is a cable tying loop that you could run them down to, tighten them up at the bottom of the case, and perhaps that wouldn't be an issue, but I'm not doing that, just to demonstrate what it's like. Hopefully you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Big shout out to my YouTube members for supporting the channel. Click that join button to find out the benefits of being a member. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.